Bryant, second video on the front end. I got the pickle forks. So actually what I wanted to do is I know a lot of you will find this boring, but some of you actually won't. So I want to kind of give you a rundown of different tools and things like that you might have to use when you get into much of anything, and maybe kind of decipher some of the language that's used with a lot of this stuff. And then I'll give you a better view of some of the parts that I described yesterday that you really couldn't see because of the lighting in here. Ratchets. It's pretty straightforward. This is a ratchet. You're all pretty familiar with those, but when you start talking about drive size, a lot of people probably don't understand what they're talking about. If you can see this right here, this is what they call 1/4-inch drive. This is good for small stuff. Little screws with nut drivers and small bolts that aren't overly tight, because you can see if you get too rough with one of these, you can shear this off. But they're great for smaller bolts, smaller places where you get your hands. This is pretty common too, 3/8 drive, as you can see. This measurement is 3/8 of an inch. Take more torque, take a little bit more abuse. Bigger stuff that's moderately stuck, if that makes any sense. And then some of you, probably fewer, get into 1/2-inch drive, which is for, of course, again, larger bolts, stuff that's tighter, torqued a little tighter, and so on. Now that is the norm for most people. Some of you will get into 1/2-inch drive stuff. Very few of you will get into one of these, which is 3/4 drive. Thanks to my dad for letting me borrow this. I personally don't own one, but he has for years and years and years. He's got a complete set that go all the way up to 3 inches, which is the size of the actual bolt or nut. So again, thanks Dad for letting me borrow that, because it's not something that most people would ever really invest in. While we're talking about ratchets, different sizes and different sockets do different things, as I'm going to show you. This is what you'd call a regular shallow well socket. Okay, pretty self-explanatory. It's pretty short. If you look in here, it's got 6 points. That's what you'd call a 6-point shallow socket. Okay, 6 points for really tight stuff is better than a 12-point, because 12 points have a tendency to round bolts if they're too tight. So if you can, use a 6-point. Then you get into deep well sockets, which are exactly what they mean. They will handle a longer bolt or a nut on a longer bolt. As it retracts, it will slide into this socket, where a short well won't do that. And again, you can get them in 6 or 12. And deep wells, I would recommend that you do both, because if you see the thickness of this wall, the difference between a 6 and a 12, 12s are a lot shallower, which means they will fit in tighter places around bolts that are in tight places. So that gives you an idea. And of course, these are 3/8 drive. I will move on to the pickle forks, which this is a pickle fork. Okay, they make them to either have this, these removable handles. This is meant to be struck by a hammer, a regular claw hammer or a plug hammer, whichever you have. And then there is another adapter for one of these, which is an air hammer. This is not a ratchet. This does not rotate. It's actually nothing but a hammer. It hits, and it hits hard, and it hits fast. And I won't use that because these things are brutally loud. So if you ever are so inclined to use an air hammer, unless you're like me and you're half deaf already, make sure you wear ear protection, because these things will tear your eardrums out if you're doing anything like rivets like this. These are going to have a chisel bit put in here, and those will be sheared off with a chisel. And it's loud, and it's obnoxious, and it takes a while. So onward to a little bit better discussion about ball joints themselves and tie rod ends from yesterday. Ball joint, upper, These are tie rod ends. Again, a ball and a socket joint with a Zerk fitting on it to actually force grease into it between the contacting metal surfaces. Anytime that you find a joint like that, they can't just be super, super tight, because if you do, you can actually force the ball up into the socket and bind it and wreck it, basically. So a long time ago, they designed what they call castle nuts. It looks like, you know, the like, what do they call them? The parapets on a castle. And there's reasons that those slots are there, and I'm going to show you on this particular drag link that is already broken free, that I can now take and get out of the way. This rubber boot is designed to help keep grease in there and water out. And as you can see how it works, it's just like a ball and just like a socket, okay? And these Zerk joints allow grease to be forced into those gaps to keep it lubricated. Now, different joints have got different shaft sizes, okay? That's why you're going to want to have multiple pickle forks to make sure that you can actually get in there and pry on the base of the joint and get it to pop off. This is how castle nuts work, again, because they weren't meant to be tightened right down and destroy the joint. If you look at this shaft, they go on like regular nuts, and I will show you how this actually works. Right there is a hole in these individual shafts, okay? These are meant to have cotter pins slid through them. So your cotter pin is going to slide through these. So of course when you tighten them, you're going to want to line two parallel slots up with that hole, and it locks that nut. It will not allow that nut to back off and fall out, okay? Once these are bent over where they belong, it crimps that nut right on there without having to torque it so tightly that you actually ruin the joint, okay? And of course, cotter pins come in different sizes for different size joints. These big ball joints have got pretty decent sized castle nuts and cotter pins in them to just as keepers for the nuts. So we'll set that aside, and then I'm going to show you how to pop one of these joints. If you look right here, this is cast iron. There's nothing here other than steel, just iron, pig iron, okay? If you look at a pickle fork, it's angled and flat. What you want to do is you want to make sure the flat side is on the solid part of the joint, okay? So that as it pounded in there, it wedges and actually pushes against this, you know, the free end of the joint, versus this, which will not move. You could beat on it all day and you're not going to bend that or break it. But the idea is to force this shaft up out of that hole so you can either replace or service tie rods, ball joints, you know, whatever it is that you happen to have at any given time. And if you watch it, it's actually prying on the part that you want to, because your beveled side is up on that joint.